This is the second week. We're talking about we're just going to cover one chapter this week, and the chapter is biopsychology. I teach this class. It's Psych 255. I teach this class mainly because I was a lab tech for 30 years, so I have a medical background, and all of this makes a lot of sense to me, of course, because that's what I did. What I did in the service. So let's go ahead and get going. Psychological researchers study genetics in order to better understand the biological factors that contribute to certain behaviors. While all humans share certain biological mechanisms, we are each unique. And while our bodies have many of the same parts, brains and hormones and cells with genetic codes, these are expressed in a wide variety of behaviors, thoughts, and reactions. Why do two people infected by the same disease have different outcomes, one surviving and one succumbing to the ailment? And of course, we saw this with COVID-19. The fact that some people got the disease, it was like a cold, and it just kind of passed over. Other people got it, and they got what isn't referred to as long haul, what was called long haul in the beginning, where they will be potentially perpetually sick for the rest of their lives. Other individuals got the disease. It really wiped them out fairly quickly, and they didn't make it. How are genetic diseases passed through family lines? A good example would be the hemophilia that affected the royal families of Europe at the turn of the 20th century. Are there genetic components to psychological disorders such as depression or schizophrenia? And this is a question we've been asking ourselves for an extended length of time. Looks like there may be. To what extent might there be a psychological basis to health conditions such as childhood obesity? My mother has brown eyes and my father has blue eyes. Of course, both of them are no longer with us, but when they were alive, my mom had brown eyes and my dad had blue eyes. Brown eyes are dominant while blue eyes are recessive. Anytime a brown eyed gene is present, the offspring will have brown eyes. Blue eyed people have two recessive blue eyed genes, otherwise, they would have brown eyes. Now, the curious thing is that I have three brown eyed let's see, I have, wait a minute. There are three of the six kids in our family had brown eyes, and three of the six kids had blue eyes, and I have blue eyes. So, when my wife and I had children, she had brown eyes, I have blue eyes. Both of the kids have brown eyes. However, when my daughter had her son, he has blue eyes. So obviously, we know that she's heterozygous brown because her mother had brown eyes and her father had blue eyes. As weird as that may seem. My first sister was born with blue eyes. My first brother had brown eyes. My second sister had brown eyes. I was a number 4 with blue eyes. My second brother has brown eyes. And my baby brother has blue eyes. Brown eyes and blue eyes. Why did half my siblings have brown eyes and half have blue eyes? My father's sperm always carried the blue-eyed trait because he was homozygous. Homo means same, so all his genes were the same. They were blue. It was my mother who determined the eye color by the genes in her heterozygous ova. Hetero meaning other or different. Half of my mother's ova had dominant brown genes, and the other half had recessive blue genes. In product, 3 blue-eyed offspring and 3 brown-eyed offspring. Let's talk about something more serious than eye color, like sickle cell anemia. When a man and a woman with sickle cell trait have children, they have a 25% chance of having a child with sickle cell anemia, a 25% chance of having a child with sickle cell trait, and a 50% chance of having a child without sickle cell trait, and 50% chance of having a child with sickle cell trait. Now here, this is what a sickle cell looks like. As you can see, it's not round like other red blood cells. It is sickle shaped. So this this good or bad? Well, one of the children will have sickle cell anemia, which means that child will barely make it into their 20s. One of the child will not have sickle cell anemia, will not have the sickle cell trait, and because they don't have the sickle cell trait, they will be susceptible to malaria, and they potentially won't make it to their 20th birthday either. But there are two children with the sickle cell trait, two out of the four children, and those two children will be, it will give them a chance to survive malaria, and of course they don't have sickle cell anemia, so they won't die. So in the malarial Africa, um, if you have four children, and you have the sickle cell trait, and your husband has the sickle cell trait, then probably 2 out of 4 of your children will survive to be 20 years old. It is thought that sickle cell is a positive adaptation in areas where malaria is prevalent. People with sickle cell trait rarely get the severe forms of malaria. 8 to 10% of African Americans have sickle cell trait, while 0.3% have sickle cell anemia. Genetic variation, the genetic difference between individuals, is what contributes to a species' adaptation to its environment. In humans, genetic variation begins with an egg, about 100 million sperm, and fertilization. Fertile women ovulate roughly once per month, releasing an egg from follicles in the ovary. During the egg's journey from the ovary through the fallopian tubes to the uterus, a sperm may fertilize the egg. And that's what these guys are trying to do. The egg and the sperm each contain 23 chromosomes. Chromosomes are long strings of genetic material known as deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. DNA is a helix-shaped molecule made up of nucleotide base pairs. In each chromosome, sequences of DNA make up genes that control or partially control a number of visible characteristics known as traits, such as eye color, hair color, and so on. A single gene may have multiple possible variations, or alleles. An allele is a specific version of a gene. So a given gene may code for the trait of hair color, and the different alleles of that gene affect which hair color an individual has. When a sperm and egg fuse, there are 23 chromosomes combined to create a zygote with 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs. 23 pairs from the mother, 23 pairs from the father. Therefore, each parent contributes half the genetic information carried by the offspring. The resulting physical characteristics of the offspring, called the phenotype, are determined by the interaction of genetic material supplied by the parents. Phenotype refers to the individual's genetic material that is expressed or shown, which can be influenced by the environment. Genotype is the genetic material, whether expressed or not. And so the genotype we don't know what the genotype looks like. We know what the phenotype is because the phenotype is expressed, but the genotype isn't always. Gene mutations provide one source of harmful genes. A mutation is a sudden permanent change in a gene. While many mutations can be harmful or lethal, once in a while, a mutation benefits an individual by giving that person an advantage over those who do not have the mutation. The theory of evolution asserts that individuals best adapted to their particular environments are more likely to reproduce and pass on their genes to future generations. And potentially, that's where blue eyes came in. Now, why blue eyes? It didn't hurt anybody, so potentially, and maybe there was a sexual selection. Individuals are going, hubba hubba, look at that. That one has blue eyes. I think that's the one I want. That's the one I want to reproduce with. That may have been why blue eyes were selected. They have estimated that blue eyes weren't around until about 10,000 years ago, and since then, of course, blue eyes have become very common, along with green eyes and gray eyes or hazel eyes. Um, so once upon a time, there were only brown eyes in the world, brown-eyed humans, and now, of course, we have several different variations of brown, variations like blue and green and hazel. Each of us represents a unique interaction between our genetic makeup and our environment, and this is known as range of reaction. This is one way to describe this interaction. Range of reaction asserts that our genes set the boundaries within which we can operate, and our environment interacts with the genes to determine where in that range we will fall. Another perspective on the interaction between genes and the environment is the concept of genetic environmental correlation. Our genes influence our environment, and our environment influences the expression of our genes. Not only do our genes and environment interact, as in range of reaction, but they also influence one another bidirectionally. A child of an NBA player would probably be exposed to basketball from an early age. Such exposure might allow the child to realize his or her full genetic athletic potential. Thus, the parent's genes, which the child shares, influence the child's environment, and that environment in turn is well suited to support the child's genetic potential. And of course, these are examples. This is Stephen Curry, and that's his dad, and I can't remember what his dad's first name was. But this is Ken Griffey Jr., that's Ken Griffey Sr., this is Bobby Bonds, this is Barry Bonds, and this is Vladimir Guerrero, and this is Vladimir Guerrero Jr., if I remember correctly. Anyway, so the environment is part of this. Now, there are a lot of children of baseball stars or basketball stars that do not become stars themselves. These are just four examples of people that did. In another approach to gene-environment interactions, the field of epigenetics looks beyond the genotype itself and studies how the same genotype can be expressed in different ways. Researchers study how the same genotype can lead to very different phenotypes. Genes affect more than our physical characteristics. Scientists have found genetic linkages to a number of behavioral characteristics, ranging from basic personality traits to sexual orientation to spirituality. Genes are also associated with temperament and a number of psychological disorders such as depression and schizophrenia. While it is true that genes provide the biological blueprints for our cells, tissues, organs, and body, they also have a significant impact on our experiences and our behaviors. A 2004 study by Finnish psychologist Pekka Tineri and colleagues of people who were given up for adoption, adoptees whose biological mothers had schizophrenia and who had been raised in a disturbed family environment, were much more likely to develop schizophrenia or another psychotic disorder than were any of the other groups in the study. That's a disturbed environment. That's what that's supposed to be. Of adoptees whose biological mothers had schizophrenia, high genetic risk, and who were raised in disturbed family environments, 36.8% were likely to develop schizophrenia. Of adoptees whose biological mothers had schizophrenia, high genetic risk, and who were raised in healthy family environments, 5.8% were likely to develop schizophrenia. So the worse the environment, the more likely the individual would develop schizophrenia. Of adoptees with a low genetic risk whose mothers did not have schizophrenia and who were raised in disturbed family environments, 5.3% were likely to develop schizophrenia. Oh, he doesn't want the milk, he wants the beer. There you go. Of adoptees with a low genetic risk, whose mothers did not have schizophrenia and who were raised in healthy family environments, 4.8% were likely to develop schizophrenia. Biological psychologists seek biological evidence for psychological phenomena. They study how mental processes and behavior are linked to biological structures and processes. They concentrate on such structures as neurons, the nervous system in general, the cerebral cortex, the endocrine system, and heredity. The main structure of the nervous system is the nerve cell or neurons. All our functions, sensations, and perceptions are controlled by neurons. We are born with 100 billion, mostly in the brain. Neurons communicate through an electrochemical process triggered by a chemical known as a neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter passes from one neuron to the other through a narrow gap called a synapse. And this is a synapse right here. And these are the neurotransmitters, these blue balls. The neurotransmitter then triggers an electrical imbalance in the receiving neuron that causes the neuron to discharge its own neurotransmitter at the other end of the cell. The brain and body not only contain neurons, but a large number of glial cells as well. Glial cells are the housekeeping cells of the neurons, nourishing them, protecting them, and directing their growth. The neuron receives information from tentacle-like structures known as dendrites. As a living cell, the neuron must maintain a nucleus, which is located in its cell body called a soma. The neuron transmits its message through its main stalk, a structure called the axon. So these are the dendrites. This is the soma. And this is the axon. And these are more dendrites. At the end of the axon is a bulbous structure known as a terminal. Messages that are collected by the dendrites pass through the soma and into the axon for transmission to the next neuron or muscle. At the end of the terminal is a synaptic cleft. Some axons are wrapped in a fatty sheath called a myelin. The myelin is actually constructed of specialized glial cells called Schwann cells. The myelin is segmented into sausage-like structures with the openings between the segments called the nodes of Ranvier. Myelin insulates the axon from the electrical charged atmosphere around the neuron. Myelin accelerates the response of 110 times and looks white as compared to gray matter. And now we know why some of your brain looks like gray matter, looks gray, and some of it looks white. The white stuff is covered in Schwann cells. If it's not covered in Schwann cells, it looks gray. A disease of the myelin is multiple sclerosis. In this disease, the fatty myelin is replaced with fibrous tissue that interrupts impulses and makes it difficult to function. Eventually, MS sufferers lose their mobility due to non-functional motor nerves in the legs and back. The sufferer will be able to maintain functioning until the nerve damage becomes severe enough to destroy the nerve. When a stimulus comes into the body, it travels to the central nervous system, and that includes the brain and the spinal column. And it comes in through afferent neurons. When the central nervous system sends out a response, it travels through efferent neurons. Afferent nerves carry sensory information from sense organs toward the central nervous system. Efferent nerves carry information away from the central nervous system to the muscles and the glands. Afferent and efferent. And you can remember this by afferent is the alphabetical order. So afferent goes to the central nervous system, and efferent goes away from the central nervous system. Neural impulses are electrochemical impulses. At rest, the electrical charge inside the neuron is at negative 70 millivolts. The charge is negative because of the increased amount of negative chloride ions. Also inside the neuron are positively charged potassium ions. Outside the cell are positively charged sodium ions. Now, if you know anything about chemistry, you know that sodium and chloride put together make salt. So where did humans come from? They crawled out of the ocean. Actually, this is how evolution works. Everything started in the ocean. When a chemical neurotransmitter signals a need for a response, it changes the permeability of the membrane of the cell. Sodium gates and potassium gates open, and some potassium rushes out and lots of sodium rushes in. This area becomes depolarized and starts a chain reaction up the neuron. So what do we know? We know that the chloride ions are what make it negative, and we know that sodium ions are positive, and we know that potassium ions are positive as well. So what is potassium chloride? That's salt. What is sodium chloride? That's also salt. Different type of salt. So much sodium rushes in that the negative 70 millivolts converts to positive 40 millivolts. The change of 110 millivolts is a neuron's action potential. As soon as it fires, the neuron starts recovering by dumping sodium and picking up potassium. Neurons only fire completely in what is known as the all or none principle. When an axon communicates a synapse, when an axon communicates at a synapse with its partner, it sends a flood of neurotransmitter across the synaptic cleft to excite the next neuron. More neurotransmitter than is necessary is sent across the cleft. To stop the response process, the neuron reabsorbs the neurotransmitter in the cleft in select reuptake sites. So it takes it back in. This is known as reuptake. So if you've ever heard of an antidepressant called a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, what it does is that it selectively blocks the reuptake of serotonin. And because there's more serotonin in the synaptic cleft than there would have been, it makes whatever the serotonin does, it makes the serotonin do that even more. So what does it do? What does serotonin do? Well, serotonin makes you feel good. So if we block the reuptake of serotonin, then we're making you feel good. Now, how long does it take to build up a therapeutic level of serotonin? The answer is somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks. And of course, so when we give somebody an antidepressant, what we're doing is we're trying to chemically induce them to feel better, less depressed. And that we do that by selectively blocking the reuptake of serotonin. Acetylcholine causes muscle contractions. It is involved with the hippocampus to create long-term memory. The death of acetylcholine producing cells in the brain adds to the rapid memory loss in Alzheimer's disease. Norepinephrine or noradrenaline accelerates heart rate along with other processes. It causes general arousal. It helps in learning and memory. It tells you to eat. Norepinephrine causes the manic and manic depression. Cocaine and amphetamines cause the release and they block the reuptake of norepinephrine, and that's why you feel so wired, because they block the reuptake of norepinephrine, and now you feel general arousal. Your learning and memory seems better than it was before, and you don't want to eat. You don't need to eat because norepinephrine tells you you're done eating, so you don't get hungry. Dopamine is involved in fine muscle movement. It's also involved in learning and memory, and it also serves in emotional arousal. Schizophrenia seems to have something to do with too many dopamine receptor sites in the brain. This causes delusions and hallucinations. A deficiency of dopamine causes Parkinson's disease, palsy, tremors, and jerky muscle movements. Serotonin is involved in emotional arousal and sleep. Deficiencies of serotonin are implicated in depression, overeating, aggression, alcoholism, and insomnia. It is serotonin that acts as the inhibitory neurotransmitter to control the aggression caused by testosterone in the hypothalamus. The mood-enhancing Prozac, Zoloft, and Paxil are all known as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. LSD works because it inhibits serotonin and thus causes excitation. Endorphins inhibit pain. It takes up the receptor sites of the neurotransmitter that causes the pain response, prostaglandins, substance P, and bradykinin. Endorphins are the cause of runner's high. Endorphins can also give us a sense of competence. The peripheral nervous, we've already talked about central nervous system. Central nervous system is the brain and the spinal column. Everything else is a peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is comprised of all neurons not accounted for by the central nervous system. They are all connected to the central nervous system. One part of the peripheral nervous system is the somatic nervous system. It connects the skeletal muscles, the sensory receptors, and the surface of the body with the central nervous system. The autonomic or automatic nervous system is also part of the peripheral nervous system. It regulates things that have to take place without our thinking about it, like heartbeat, digestion, respiration, and dilation of the pupils. Two branches of the autonomic nervous system are the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic nervous system responds to stress, causing the body to ready itself for fighting or fleeing. It increases your heart rate, it causes a surge of sugar in your body, it shuts down digestion, it stops kidney function because that's a waste of energy. So it shuts these things down. The parasympathetic nervous system restores normal function after the sympathetic nervous system has caused the body changes. The spinal cord acts as an information conduit to the brain. However, some stimuli only go to the spinal column before they are responded to. These are called spinal reflexes, such as the knee-jerk response, bladder and defecating responses, as well as the sexual responses. In this case, the stimulus runs the afferent neurons to a neuron called the interneuron, and then back through the efferent neuron, so it never makes it up to the brain. Doesn't need to. If you look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, you will see that it is mostly an outer layer of white matter surrounding a core of gray matter. The gray matter is slower non-myelinated cells, and the white matter is myelinated cells. The brain has an outer layer of gray matter and an inner layer of white. So the spinal column and the brain are opposites. The spinal column has the myelinated neurons on the outside, and the brain has the myelinated neurons on the inside, with the gray matter on the outside. The human brain is much larger than any other animal save the African elephant-nosed fish. Because males are larger than most females, their brains are about 15% larger than most females. Even accounting for the size difference, the male brain is still about 5% larger. But brain size has little to do with intelligence, and there are several cerebral aspects that favor women. Female brains seem to utilize more glucose than male brains do. Female brains have a larger corpus callosum, the connection between the two hemispheres. In the 1850s, renowned French surgeon Paul Broca decided that some people were naturally smarter than other people because of their race. He figured that the individual with the largest brain would be the smartest person. He discovered that looking at hundreds of skulls from the ancients and modern races, that Eskimos had the largest brains. He next looked at at forearm to upper arm ratios. The apes have long forearms and short upper arms, and discovered that Eskimos once again had the smallest ratio of all the races that he surveyed. So does that mean that Eskimos are the smartest people in the world? Broca began a scientific endeavor where they weighed men of letters' brains after they died to see how much difference there was between individuals. Do you want to know why the Eskimos had such big brains and why their forearms uh, were so much smaller than their upper arm? What was going on? Were Eskimos really the smartest people in the world? The answer is no. Almost all humans have about the same level of intelligence. That didn't have anything to do with it. The reason that their brains were so big was because their heads were so big. Why was their heads so big? Their heads were so big because when you live in a really, really cold environment like that, your neck is shorter and your head is larger. That's the same way with your arms. Your arms, the colder it is, the people that survived were the ones with shorter arms, and because of that, their forearm to upper arm ratio was greater than anybody else's. So people that lived in where it's really, really hot all the time, they had the very opposite physical structures of Eskimos. Okay, so let's let Broca measure people's brains. Broca began a scientific endeavor where they weighed men of letters' brains after they died to see how much difference there was between individuals. Everyone was donating their brains to the endeavor because everybody wanted to be known as a smart guy. They of course, discovered that some brilliant men had fairly light brains. Intelligence has nothing to do with size, but the number of synapses developed, something represented by fissures and convolutions. So all of these fissures and convolutions have to do with how intelligent you are. The more you have, the more intelligent you are. Modern humans have brains that average about 1,500 grams. Ivan Turgenev had a brain of more than 2,000 grams. This is Turgenev right here, this melon-headed fellow. Anatole France had a brain of less than 1,000 grams, and this is Anatole France. Both of them were authors, interestingly enough. The average Neanderthal brain weighed about 1,750 grams. So were they smarter than modern humans who only had brains the size that were 1,500 grams on average? And the answer is no. Because, as I said before, size doesn't matter as far as intelligence is concerned. Some parts of the brain are prominent in lower animals, and these parts are the ones that scientists call the primitive brain. This is known as the hindbrain and consists of the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. The medulla, the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. This is the cerebellum right here. Medulla, pons, and cerebellum. Coming off the spinal cord, there's a flaring of the cord mass that is first part of the brain. This is the medulla. It regulates heartbeat, blood pressure, and respiration. It also is crucial in sleeping, sneezing, and coughing. Now you need to really protect the medulla. It's very important to protect the medulla because if you get a blow to this area of your head, then your heart will stop beating, your blood pressure will crash, and you won't be able to breathe. And it will put you into a coma, so you need to protect this area of your brain very well. Now, one of the problems that they were having is if you ride on a motorcycle and you don't wear a helmet and you fall off, your head's heavy, weighs 3 pounds, and your neck can't hold it up, and when you fall backwards, by golly, you hit in the skull, jams up against, guess what? Right here. It's right there and puts you into a coma. So I saw this over and over and over and over and over again when I was working in Omaha, at a hospital in Omaha. We had individuals that were in comas because they had been in a motorcycle accident. The pons is a rounded bulge in the front of the medulla. The pons acts as a bridge between the spinal cord and the brain. It relays information about body movement and relates to attention, sleep, and alertness. And of course, you need to protect this as well. It will put you into a coma if you get a blow to this area. The cerebellum is a small hemisphere that lies behind the pons in the medulla. And this is the cerebellum right here. The cerebellum controls balance and muscle coordination. Injury to the cerebellum will cause loss of coordination and a problem maintaining muscle tone. It is the cerebellum that is anesthetized when someone is so drunk that they are having trouble walking. Curiously enough, when you start drinking, anesthetization starts in the frontal lobe, and this is where your brilliance is housed. And so suddenly, if you drink too much alcohol, you can't move around very well. You think you can drive, and you really can't. And then by the time it makes it back to the cerebellum, it's anesthetizing the entire brain. Now you can't get your key in the lock. The reticular activating system is a structure that runs from the hindbrain and into the rest of the parts of the brain. The reticular activating system acts as an alarm clock of sorts. When something happens while you are asleep and you need to wake up for whatever it is, the reticular activating system can arouse you out of that deep sleep. Damage to or pressure on the reticular activating system will put an individual into a coma. Alcohol can affect the RAS and put someone to sleep if they drink too much. This is when you black out or brown out. The forebrain, this is the forebrain right here, that entails the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the limbic system, and the cerebrum. And of course, this is the cerebrum, the outer covering of the brain. The thalamus is located in the middle of the brain, and this is it right here, this green thing. The thalamus relays sensory information to the sensory areas of the brain. It also helps control sleep and attention to muscle coordination. The hypothalamus lies under the thalamus and above the pituitary gland. The thalamus regulates body temperature, concentration of fluids, storage of nutrients, and deals in motivation and emotion. It is involved in hunger, thirst, sexual behavior, caring for offspring, aggression, and the pleasure center. The limbic system is a group of structures that are involved in memory, motivation, and emotion. The amygdala is an almond-shaped structure that controls aggression. And this is the amygdala right here. And that's why amygdala means almond, as weird as that is. From research, we know that one part makes us aggressive and one part makes us docile, potentially having something to do with fight or flight response. The hippocampus is involved in memory formation and retrieval. And of course, this is the hippocampus. The cerebrum is that part of the brain that represents our intellectual powers. The outer portion is known as the cerebral cortex. It is primarily gray matter. The wrinkles are known as convolutions, and the valleys are known as fissures. So the more wrinkles and valleys that you have in your brain, the smarter you are. Doesn't have anything to do with size. It has to do with numbers of valleys and wrinkles. And there you go. That's what it looks like. The cerebrum has two halves, the right and the left. Brilliant way to name them. The two halves are connected by the corpus callosum. The cortex is only about 1/8 of an inch thick. Cortex in this case means bark, so it's the outer covering of the brain. It's only 1/8 of an inch thick. There are 4 lobes of the brain: frontal in front, where most of the intellectual thought takes place. Parietal is behind the frontal lobe and controls touch and movement sensations to most of the body. Occipital is in the back of the head and is our visual center. This is the occipital, parietal, and then the temporal is in the temple area and controls hearing. And this is the temporal. The sensory motor cortex is in the parietal lobe just behind the central fissure. It is where warm, cold, touch, pain, and movement for most of the body is detected. The motor cortex lies in front of the central fissure in the frontal lobe. It controls motor responses. So here's the motor cortex, and this, of course, is the somatosensory cortex. Learning language and speech are very complex responses that require stimulation in many areas of the brain. Women tend to have better language skills than men, and some evolutionary psychologists feel that it is because women have a larger corpus callosum that allows more communication between the two hemispheres. Damage to certain portions of the brain can cause curious language difficulties. Wernicke's area is in the temporal lobe. This is Wernicke's area right here, right behind your ear. It responds to auditory information. When you read something, it will travel from the occipital lobe to to be recorded as auditory information, and then then it will be transferred back to Wernicke's area for interpretation. That is why when you read, you sometimes feel as if you can hear what you are reading. Damage to Wernicke's area causes a condition known as Wernicke's aphasia, where the individual has a difficult time understanding spoken language. Sometimes after a concussion to the side of the head, it will take the person several minutes before they can understand what is being said to them. And this is one of the reasons when you have a blow to the head, we do the concussion protocol where we ask you how many fingers we're holding up. That has to do with damage to the occipital lobe. And we want you to understand what we are saying. So we say, how many fingers am I holding up? And if you don't understand that we're asking you a question about counting, then of course we know that you are concussed. And it's done damage to the temporal lobe. If you can't see, then that has damage to the occipital lobe. Broca's area is located in the frontal lobe on the side of the left hemisphere. It controls those muscles that are used during speaking. Damage to the area causes a condition known as Broca's aphasia, which is characterized by slow, laborious speech. A concussion to this part of the brain will cause slurred speech, and that's one of the reasons why we're asking you, how many fingers am I holding up? And you have to tell us, you're holding up 2 or you're holding up 3. And we're listening for whether you have slurred speech or not. The angular gyrus lies behind the visual cortex in Wernicke's area. It interprets visual cues and translates them into auditory information. Dyslexia is caused by a malfunction in the angular gyrus, making it difficult for the individuals to break written words into sounds. And of course, Wernicke's area is right here. 8 to 10% of people are left-handed. More boys are left-handed than girls. Left-handed people are more likely to have learning disabilities. They're more likely to have migraine headaches. They're more likely to be artists. They're more likely to be musicians. They're more likely to be mathematicians. Some children with epilepsy, that's an uncontrolled electrical activity in the brain that causes seizures, have to have the affected hemisphere of the brain removed. In these cases, they actually develop normally with just half a brain, having trouble with just select motor movements. There are 2 kinds of glands with ducts leading directly to the affected organ, such as your salivary gland or your sweat glands, and glands that are called ductless, that dump their affecting substance, hormones, into the bloodstream to affect another gland or organ in another part of the body. Endocrine glands function by what is called a negative feedback loop. The gland is signaled to release the hormone, and the on switch stays on until it is signaled to stop. Kind of like a gas pump that shuts off automatically. In the old days, the pituitary gland was considered the master gland. But now we understand that the hypothalamus actually tells the pituitary when to control the rest of the endocrine glands. Most of these hormones are called releasing hormones. The hypothalamus is in the middle of the brain. The pituitary gland lies right below it and is about the size of a pea. The pituitary gland produces human growth hormone, which regulates the growth of humans. Too much causes gigantism, and that's what this individual is, the tallest man in the world, and he is suffering from gigantism. Too little produces midgetism. Dwarfism is a genetic flaw that retards the growth of the long bones. So somebody who is considered a midget is somebody who has normal-sized body parts, but is shorter than normal. And normal in this case is is below 4'8". Dwarfism is a genetic flaw, and it retards the growth of the long bones. So the individuals have a normal-sized head, but their arms and their legs are shorter than they're supposed to be. This is Robert Wadlow. He was 8 feet 11 and a half inches tall, the tallest man that has ever existed. Here he is with two normal-sized people. There he is with his mother. Here he is with his brother in his house. He had 10-foot ceilings, luckily. Had a problem walking. He died at age 22. Prolactin is produced by the pituitary gland. Prolactin stimulates milk production in women. Antidiuretic hormone comes from the pituitary. It regulates fluid levels in the body to keep the individual from becoming dehydrated. Oxytocin is also a pituitary hormone. It stimulates labor in pregnant women. In some animals, oxytocin brings about cuddling and caring for young. In humans, when the nipple area is stimulated in lactating women, it stimulates the brain to produce oxytocin, which causes the breasts to eject milk. Melatonin is secreted by the pineal gland. The pineal gland is directly behind the pituitary gland. Melatonin helps regulate the sleep cycle. It may also have something to do with puberty and with aging, but we're not exactly sure what. There, for a while, they were saying that if you took melatonin, you wouldn't age as rapidly. But since then, they have said, probably not. The thyroid, this is the thyroid gland right here, this red structure around your esophagus. This is the thyroid gland. Thyroxin, or T4, is secreted by the thyroid gland. Thyroxin regulates the body's metabolism. Metabolism is the body's regulation of utilization of oxygen and production of energy. Hypothyroidism means low thyroxin production. This leads to lethargy, depressive symptoms, and weight gain. When this occurs in a newborn, it can cause stunted growth and permanent mental deficits. This condition is called cretinism. This is an individual with hypothyroidism. As you can see, this is him before they started giving him T4, and this is him afterwards. Hyperthyroidism means high thyroxin production. This leads to manic behavior, insomnia, brittle hair, bulging eyes, and weight loss. Now, if you remember, the hypothyroidism caused depression and weight gain. So hyperthyroidism is the opposite. It causes manic behavior instead of depression. Insomnia, bulging eyes, and weight loss. So these people are really, really skinny. The thyroid is regulated by thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. Corticosteroids are hormones produced in the adrenal cortex. The adrenal glands are located on top of each kidney, and the cortex is the outer layer. Corticosteroids are secreted when the individual is in a stressful situation. They promote muscle growth and cause the liver to release stored sugar. The adrenal cortex is regulated through the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, and this has to do with stress. So the more ACTH you have in your system, the more stressed out you are. Because because of the ACTH, but you are stressed and therefore you produce more ACTH. The adrenal medulla is the inner area of the adrenal gland. Adrenaline and noradrenaline, epinephrine and norepinephrine, are secreted by the adrenal medulla. Both hormones are released to help the individual deal with stress. Research has shown that adrenaline intensifies emotions. It seems to especially work on fear and anxiety. Noradrenaline raises blood pressure. The sexual glands of the individual, the testes of the males, and the ovaries of women produce testosterone. The ovaries and testes are actually the same structure during early development. With males, the embryo is bathed in ever-increasing levels of testosterone to cause them to develop male physical characteristics. When males are born, they will develop primary sexual characteristics. These characteristics will develop further with puberty and will be directly involved in reproduction, penis growth, and sperm growth. Before puberty, the male isn't producing any sperm, and his penis is much smaller. Males will develop secondary sexual characteristics that don't have anything to do with reproduction, but help males attract females. Thickening of chest and shoulder muscles, male pattern hair growth, enlargement of the voice box to create the Adam's apple and deepen the voice, and they will grow to their adult height. Synthetic testosterone, called anabolic steroids, is sometimes taken to increase muscle mass, increase resistance to stress, and overcharge the energy supply. The problem is that steroids cause liver damage, weaken the immune system, sometimes cause uncontrollable rage, and lead to kidney failure. So, not the best idea in the world. Testosterone is also found in women, but its production is much less. It assists women in the female sex drive. Estrogen is produced in large amounts by women in the ovaries and in small amounts by men in the testes. Along with progesterone, it regulates the menstrual cycle. It is an increase in the amount of estrogen being produced that triggers menarche, or the first menstrual period. It triggers secondary sexual characteristics in women, which includes ovulation and accumulation of fat in the breasts and the hips. Secondary sexual characteristics for women include a growth spurt and pubic hair growth. Estrogen has amazing powers of protection for women. Estrogen is high during the ovulatory years. It thins the blood, making women less likely to have heart attacks and strokes. It protects women from kidney stones. It acts as an antioxidant and so protects women from some cancers. It may protect women from Alzheimer's disease. Estrogen seems to have psychological effects on women. During peak times, women tend to be more positive. When estrogen is low, women are more likely to be moody and try to strangle their husbands. When estrogen levels are at the highest during ovulation, women are more interested in sexual activity than when they aren't fertile. Studies have shown that women are more attracted to men who have strong masculine features during ovulation, but are more attracted to men with more feminized features at other times, when they're not ovulating. And this is the same guy. They've just taken his head and put the right side together twice. Okay, and then this is the other side's the left side. So this is him more masculinized. This is him more feminized. Progesterone works in tandem with estrogen to regulate the menstrual cycle. Progesterone's main function is to maintain the uterus and provide for pregnancy. An increase in progesterone causes the sexual organs to mature. And that is the end of the chapter. So I'll talk to you guys next week. Have a good week.